A couple of weeks ago, I was at a Washington Nationals baseball game, and my new son-in-law has a business partner that has tickets that make the seats right behind the first base line, and I had no interest in getting a t-shirt, but they were throwing them out to the crowd at the beginning of the game, and everyone around me got up, and I got up innocently, not needing a t-shirt, and all of a sudden, one's flying sort of my way, and I'm not really wanting to catch it, but others nearby were reaching hard to catch it, and I got pushed over very quickly and hard on the hard plastic seat in front of me. And I thought I broke my rib, really. Went to the first aid person, and I could breathe, so it probably wasn't punctured, or broken in some sense, but it hurt, really. And 2 weeks later, actually, it still hurts, and it depends on the day and the time of the day, but it still hurts quite a bit. I've come to see that my ribs are integral to my well-being as a person, really. You don't think about your ribs very much at all because they're just there, and maybe you feel them sometimes, but you don't think about your ribs being a part of who you are. But like when they're not well, you laugh or you move a little bit or you say anything in some ways that's sort of out of the ordinary, and you're aware that, in fact, your rib isn't quite well yet. It's integral to my well-being. So we use this language that vocation is integral, not incidental to the mission of God. What we're arguing is that written to the very meaning of God's work in the world is vocation. It isn't on the side of, it isn't an afterthought, it isn't what you do after work, it isn't Sunday morning in some sense. I mean, it really is part of the rhythm of the work and worship of God in the world. This deeply Hebraic, vision of avodah, where in some ways there's a seamlessness between our worship and our work, and that all of life is meant to be worship to God, of sacramental, of giving of ourselves to God. So we see, vocation that way, which we argue is a very big word, a very complex word. It isn't just work, it includes work, but vocation is my whole of life lived before the face of God. So all that I am as a man, as a human being. It is my relationship to God, but it's also my relationship to my wife and to my children and to my neighbors and my friends. It's my citizenship. It is also my work as a teacher. We see that what God's doing in and through the world is done in and through the vocations of his people. One of my own great teachers was a man named John Stott, and if you've been paying attention to the evangelical church in the last generation or so, everyone knows John Stott, who died a few years ago. I remember sitting next to Harvey Kahn, who was a long professor at Westminster Seminary many years ago at an Urbana conference, and we were just listening to Stott answer question upon question upon question in the afternoons. And Harvey turned to me and said, if Protestants had popes, he'd be our pope, which I thought was probably pretty good, really. But Stott, after the first Lausanne Convention in the early 1970s, gave a series of lectures at Oxford University at Wycliffe Hall. And they were on 5 words, and the 5 words were basic words to Christian discipleship. But the first was the word mission. And Stott did what he typically would do, which was to take up in biblical theological exposition, this is what the mission of Christ is, what it was, what we understand it to be, is what the church teaches about the mission of Christ in the world. Just the best of what Stott would do. Looking at it in terms of its anthropology, but also its missiology, holding those quite closely together. But then he says, if we get the mission of Christ right, then we will have to rethink what we mean by vocation and repent of the hierarchy which we've established and offered as the church to the world. That there are certain vocations which are higher and more important to God, and others which are much less important to God. And his own hierarchy, as he listed in the essay, is that, of course, a cross-cultural missionary is at the highest, the zenith of works that God cares about in the world. A little bit less serious as a pastor at home in a church. A little bit less serious as a nurse or a doctor or a teacher. Or all the way down to the very bottom of the list, he says, as a politician. And he says we have to repent of this unbiblical way of seeing the world and our life in the world and our work in the world if we get the mission of Christ right. And so for us to argue that vocation is integral to the missio Dei, to the mission of God, to the work of God in the world, is to argue, in fact, what I think the best of Christian theology teaches, that the mission of God is this, who we are as human beings is this, and in fact, if that's true, then we have to rethink what we mean by vocation.